first, let's go straight to the UK House of Commons, where a special session is taking place to pay tribute to Queen Elizabeth II. That's happening right now.
Tributes. The House will then sit again tomorrow at 1 o'clock. The first business will be oath-taking for a small number of senior members. Members to be invited to take the oath tomorrow are being contacted by my office. All other members will have an opportunity to take the oath when the House returns. After oath-taking tomorrow, tributes will be continued. The House is expected to sit till approximately 10 p.m. The House is not expected to sit on Sunday. I now call the Prime Minister, Elizabeth Truss.
Mr. Speaker, in the hours since last night's shocking news, we have witnessed the most heartfelt outpouring of grief at the loss of Her late Majesty, the Queen. Crowds have gathered, flags have been lowered to half-mast, tributes have been sent from every continent around the world. On the death of her father, King George VI, Winston Churchill said the news had stilled the clatter and traffic of 20th century life in many lands. Now, 70 years later, in the tumult of the 21st century, life has paused again. Her late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, was one of the greatest leaders the world has ever known. She was the rock on which modern Britain was built. She came to the throne at just 25, in a country that was emerging from the shadow of war. She bequeaths a modern, dynamic nation that has grown and flourished under her reign. The United Kingdom is the great country it is today because of her. The Commonwealth is the family of nations it is today because of her. She was devoted to the union of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. She served 15 countries as head of state, and she loved them all. Her words of wisdom gave us strength in the most testing times. During the darkest moments of the pandemic, she gave us hope that we would meet again. She knew this generation of Britons would be as strong as any.
The late Queen would have wanted us to redouble our efforts, to turn our collar up and face the storm, to carry on. Most of all, she would want us to remember that it is in these moments that we must pull together. This House is a place where ideas and ideals are debated. Of course, that leads to passionate disagreement. Of course, temperatures can run high. But we all do it in pursuit of something greater. We do it because we believe we can make this great country and its people greater still. At this moment of uncertainty, where our country feels caught between a past it cannot relive and a future yet to be revealed, we must always remember one of the great lessons of our Queen's reign, that we are always better when we rise above the petty, the trivial, the day-to-day, to focus on the things that really matter, the things that unite us, rather than those which divide us. Our Elizabethan age may now be over, but her legacy will live on forever. And as the children of that era, it falls upon us to take that legacy forward, to show the same love of country, the love of one another, as she did, to show empathy and compassion, as she did, and to get Britain through this dark night and bring it into the dawn, as she did. We join together today not just to say goodbye to our Queen, to share in our mourning, but to say something else important. God save the King, because as one era ends, so another begins. King Charles III has been a devoted servant of this country his entire life. He has been a powerful voice for fairness and understood the importance of the environment long before many others. As he ascends to his new role, with the Queen Consort by his side, the whole House indeed the whole country, will join today to wish him a long, happy and successful reign. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, the emotions we see across the nation today are echoed across the Commonwealth to which our Queen was so committed, in the church to which our Queen was so devoted, and in the armed forces which she led and her family served. Around the world, people will be united in mourning for her passing and united in celebrating her life. We've already seen beautiful tributes flow from across the world. It would be impossible to capture them all here. But each one is a reminder of the esteem in which she was held, of what she achieved on behalf of her country, of the shared values we treasure. The reason our loss feels so profound is not just because she stood at the head of our country for 70 years, but because, in spirit, she stood amongst us. As we move forward, as we forge a new path, as we build towards a better future, she will always be with us, for all she gave us and all she will continue to give us. We say thank you. May our Queen rest in peace. God save the King.
I now call on the Father of the House, Sir Peter Bottomley.
Constituents will wish me briefly to record their love, respect and gratitude to Her late Majesty. We can give continuing life to her values and virtues of kindness, aspiration, perseverance and pride. We thank her, we miss her, and we should say what she would wish: God save the King.
Yeah. I now call on the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is, of course, with great sadness that we unite to offer our prayers, focus our sorrow, and gather our collective thoughts on the passing of Her Majesty the Queen. On behalf of the Scottish National Party, I would like to offer my condolences as we hold the Queen and her family in our thoughts and prayers at this difficult time. The grief and mourning which reverberates around this chamber and across the world will be all the more acute for the King and members of the royal family. Only they can understand the deep personal loss of a close family member, and people across society who have similarly lost loved ones will understand the pain that they must feel as we ensure our heartfelt condolences are with them today. Over the coming days, people up and down these islands will seek to come to terms in their own private way with the loss of one of the true constants in all our lives. In that regard, my thoughts are also with our own Prime Minister, just days into office, and having to come to terms with the enormity of the loss of the head of state and show the leadership that is now required in her position. We can also help but dwell on the late Queen, who, right to the end, fulfilled her duty by appointing the new Prime Minister. But of course, many will feel this as a deeply personal loss, for the Queen's continuous and abiding presence and the leadership she has shown over 7 decades will be the enduring marker to the remarkable tenure as our head of state. Her Majesty the Queen has been head of state for longer than most of us have been alive, and the majority of us have never known a public life without the Queen at the helm. For many, she has been a steady hand guiding the ship and a perpetual symbol of stability. 15 Prime Ministers and 5 First Ministers of Scotland have benefited from her institutional knowledge and, of course, her wise counsel. As the figurehead of the Commonwealth, she was a unifying force recognised the world over, visiting at least 117 countries, and was committed to celebrating the diverse values and cultures around the globe, all born out of a duty to serve. During her reign, the world has changed immeasurably, through the good times and the bad times, through war and peace, through boom and bust, through the advances in technology and communication and the dawn of the internet age. To many, she was a guiding light, ever present as she bore witness to the evolution of these islands into the modern era. A thread of continuity running through the fabric of the Commonwealth, at once tying societies to our shared histories and making new history. I, like many others in this chamber, was fortunate to meet the Queen on a number of occasions and was always struck by the strength, the intellect, the modesty, the humility, and often the humour with which she approached her royal duties. And while I have always met her in a professional context as monarch, I'm struck with just how many people across Scotland, and indeed across the United Kingdom, have had a first-hand encounter with the Queen. Whether they have been invited to her Holyrood garden parties or had the pleasure to meet with her in the many hundreds of events, walkabouts and official openings, including that at our Scottish Parliament, or whether she had taken them wholly by surprise with chance encounters on the countryside or villages near Balmoral, people the length and breadth of Scotland have their own tales of their individual meetings with the Queen. Because she was a monarch who reigned with compassion and integrity and established a deep connection with the public. And the affection which the Queen had for Scotland and that Scotland had for the Queen cannot be underestimated. On the Queen's first visit to Scotland following her coronation, the moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland said to her, "Today, you and I are Scotland, greeting with all that we have to offer of love and duty, our gracious young Queen." We can today look back on these words and say that for as long as Her Majesty reigned, both she and Scotland held true to these values of love and duty for one another. Speaking when she reconvened our Scottish Parliament in 1999, Her Majesty set out the obligation on members to set lasting standards of vision and purpose, of debate and discussion, not just for our own generation, but for future generations. And it is clear that members across the Scottish Parliament, and I trust in this place, from all walks of political life, have moved forward with that sense of vision and purpose in mind. There is a deeply held sense of responsibility across political parties to govern for the betterment of future generations. In our case, to uphold the values of the Scottish Parliament, which are inscribed in the ceremonial mace: wisdom, justice, compassion and integrity. The values that set the aspirations for a modern Scotland, the values that so often embodied by Her Majesty herself. And in what was sadly her final ever address to the Scottish Parliament, her love of Scotland and its people was clear when she said, "It is the people that make a place, and there are few places where this is truer than it is in Scotland." The relationship between Scotland and the Queen was one of shared admiration. Indeed, whilst she was everyone's Queen, for many in Scotland, she was Elizabeth, Queen of Scots. Her Majesty's roots in Scotland run deep. She was descended from the royal house of Stuart on both sides, and her family, of course, her mother, was from Glamis and Angus. It is clear that these family ties gave way to a great and enduring affection, and Scotland was a place that was truly held dear to her, not only in an official capacity, but in a private capacity as well. It is well known that Balmoral, with its beautiful and atmospheric scenery, was the Queen's favourite home. Balmoral was a place where she was able to enjoy freedom, peace and the ability to indulge her love of the great outdoors, whether that was walking with her dogs, riding with horses, hosting picnics and barbecues, or from behind the wheel of her Land Rover. It is clear that Balmoral has been a place of peace and sanctuary for her throughout her whole life, and perhaps particularly so following the death of her husband, life companion and love, His Royal Highness Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. It is therefore perhaps fitting that she has met her final peace at Balmoral, a place where she found such enjoyment and comfort. And as someone of demonstrably strong faith, she will now have enduring peace with herself and, of course, to be reunited with Prince Philip. Her Majesty was a life of grace and wisdom, defined by its service to the public and by the lives that she touched. Her legacy and her enduring presence will live on. God bless the Queen. May she rest in peace. God bless the King.
Boris Johnson.
All right, so we are hearing from the House of Commons as they pay tribute to Queen Elizabeth. We started off with Prime Minister Liz Truss, who recalls what the world has witnessed over the past few hours since the news of the Queen's passing was made public, and of course paying tribute to her as the rock that modern Britain was built on. Let's listen to Boris Johnson as he pays his tribute in the House of Commons.
Ask them to go away. And I know that today there are countless people in this country and around the world who have experienced the same sudden access of unexpected emotion. And I think millions of us are trying to understand why we are feeling this deep and personal and almost familial sense of loss. Perhaps it's partly that she's always been there, a changeless human reference point in British life, the person who, all the surveys say, appears most often in our dreams, so unvarying in her pole star radiance that we have perhaps been lulled into thinking that she might be in some way eternal. But I think our shock is keener today because we are coming to understand in her death the full magnitude of what she did for us all. And think of what we asked that 25-year-old woman all those years ago. To be the person so globally trusted that her image should be on every unit of our currency, every postage stamp, the person in whose name all justice is dispensed in this country, every law passed, to whom every minister of the Crown swears allegiance, and for whom every member of our armed services is pledged, if necessary, to lay down their lives. Think what we asked of her in that moment. Not just to be the living embodiment in her DNA of the history and continuity and unity of this country, but to be the figurehead of our entire system, the keystone in the vast arch of the British state, a role that only she could fulfill because in the brilliant and durable bargain of the constitutional monarchy, only she could be trusted to be above any party political or commercial interest and to incarnate impartially the very concept and essence of the nation. Think what we asked of her and think what she gave. She showed the world not just how to reign over a people, she showed the world how to give, how to love, and how to serve. And as we look back at that vast arc of service, its sheer duration is almost impossible to take in. She was the last living person in British public life to have served in uniform in the Second World War. She was the first female member of the royal family in 1,000 years to serve full-time in the armed forces, and that impulse to do her duty carried her right through into her 10th decade to the very moment in Balmoral, as my right honourable friend has said, only 3 days ago, when she saw off her 14th Prime Minister and welcomed her 15th. And I can tell you, in that audience, she was as radiant and as knowledgeable and as fascinated by politics as ever I can remember, and as wise in her advice as anyone I know, if not wiser. And over that extraordinary span of public service, with her naturally retentive and inquiring mind, I think, and doubtless many of the 15 would agree, that she became the greatest statesman and diplomat of all. And she knew instinctively how to cheer up the nation, how to lead a celebration. I remember her innocent joy more than 10 years ago after the opening ceremony of the London Olympics, when I told her that the leader of a friendly Middle Eastern country seemed actually to believe that she had jumped out of a helicopter in a pink dress and parachuted into the stadium. And I remember her equal pleasure on being told just a few weeks ago that she had been a smash hit in her performance with Paddington Bear. And perhaps more importantly, she knew how to keep us going when times were toughest. In 1940, when this country and this democracy faced the real possibility of extinction, she gave a broadcast, aged only 14, that was intended to reassure the children of Britain. She said then, "We know, every one of us, that in the end, all will be well." She was right. And she was right again in the darkest days of the COVID pandemic, when she came on our screens and told us that we would meet again. And we did. And I know I speak for other Prime Ministers, when I say ex-Prime Ministers, when I say that she helped to comfort and guide us, as well as the nation, because she had the patience and the sense of history to see that troubles come and go, and that disasters are seldom as bad as they seem. And it was that indomitability, that humour, that work ethic, and that sense of history, which together made her Elizabeth the Great. And when I call her that, I should add one, Elizabeth the Great, I should add one final quality, of course, which was her humility. Her single-bar electric fire Tupperware using refusal to be grand. And unlike us politicians, with our outriders and our armour-plated convoys, I can tell you, as a direct eyewitness, that she drove herself in her own car with no detectives and no bodyguard, bouncing at alarming speed over the Scottish landscape to the total amazement of the ramblers and the tourists we encountered. And it is that indomitable spirit with which she created the modern constitutional monarchy. An institution so strong and so happy and so well understood, not just in this country, but in the Commonwealth and around the world, that the succession has already seamlessly taken place. And I believe she would regard it as her own highest achievement, that her son, Charles III, will clearly and amply follow her own extraordinary standards of duty and service. And the fact that today we can say with such confidence, "God save the King," is a tribute to him, but above all to Elizabeth the Great, who worked so hard for the good of her country, not just now, but for generations to come. That is why we mourn her so deeply. And it is in the depths of our grief that we understand why we loved her so much.
We now come to Mother of the House, Harriet Hahn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and what an excellent speech from the Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge, which I'm sure will have resonated in every member of this House and indeed everyone in this country. It was a brilliant speech. I'm grateful for the opportunity to pay my tribute to the Queen and to do so on my own behalf, but also on behalf of my constituents, particularly those who, coming from Commonwealth countries in Africa and the Caribbean, held the Queen in such high regard. We're a constitutional monarchy, and for we MPs, the Queen was ever present in the interwoven relationship between the monarch and her Parliament. She underpinned our democratic system for over 70 years, underpinning it but never intervening in it. She was always salient but never meddled. She avoided controversy not by staying in the background, far from it. She performed her role to the utmost, but she did it by respecting the boundaries. She carried out her duties and gave us her full commitment for us to carry out ours. When many denigrated, she always respected and supported Parliament, and we should be very grateful for that. Between her ministers, and not just prime ministers, there was regular contact. After Labour won the election in 1997, I went up to the palace where, like the other new secretaries of state, she appointed me to the Privy Council and bestowed on me the seals of office. They are actual seals which are given to you and you take back to your department to be locked in a safe. But when just a year later I was sacked,
across not just the country, but also around the world for her love and passion of horses. Whether it was the famous visits to Ascot or Epsom, the Derby itself, all of those who attended wanted to just snip that moment with her, to get that glimmer, hoping to get that royal wave, or even a famous racing tip as well. And of course, no one did more to champion horse racing in this country than the late Queen. She loved the sport, she loved her horses, and in return, the whole racing industry loved her and will miss her enormously. Her late Majesty led a remarkable life, Mr. Speaker, and delivered an era and reign that will stand out as being the most magnificent in the long and great history of our nation. As we mourn the end of her 70th year reign, we commemorate the great life that she lived and, of course, the long service, the distinguished service that she gave to our country. We reflect on the importance of the monarch in our public life, of course, and at this particular time, a moment in time, our thoughts and prayer are naturally with her family. And we offer our wholehearted support and, of course, our commitment to the King, King Charles III. In the years ahead, while the faces on our notes and coins and stamps will, of course, change, Her late Majesty will always occupy a special place and an affectionate in the hearts of our nation. God rest her soul, and God save the King.
Hear, hear. Dame Margaret Beckett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've heard it said that on occasions like this, most of us talk about ourselves, and that's inevitable because we're talking about the links we have in our memories with the person who is gone. But I think perhaps I'm one of the few in this House who does remember when the Queen's father died. I must admit my memories are twofold. First, how surprised I was that people thought 25 was young. And secondly, that when she came to the throne, we all got a bar of chocolate. I first encountered Her Majesty at one remove, soon after I was first elected to this House in October 1974, and I do recognise that many honourable members here were not born then. By 1975, I was a junior government whip. We had a small majority and a large legislative programme. And there was a duty that usually fell to a very senior whip, one of writing every day, by hand, direct to Her Majesty the Queen to tell her what was happening in her Parliament. I was told this had probably originated with the first Prime Minister who wrote to the King to tell him what was happening in the House. And I was asked to undertake this duty to help my colleague. It seemed to me, I was told, by the way, this is very important, that this was a personal message from a member of the government to Her Majesty for her eyes only. That is relevant. And it seemed to me that there was very little point in telling her the things she knew from her red box, or that she had read probably in the chat column in the Daily Telegraph. So what I wrote to her about was the stuff that I thought she wouldn't get from either of those sources. I wrote to her about the gossip in the tea. Occasionally slightly edited. And I wrote to her about the rows that people were having behind the scenes in committee rooms or in corridors. There was no feedback, but there wasn't any rebuke either. But then a day came when the Queen went on an overseas visit. Now, I knew, of course, that official correspondence always goes through official channels when the Queen is out of the country. But I was a very new MP, and I thought that something that was marked from me personally to the Queen personally, that no one would have the impertinence to read that. Some busybody in number 10, however, did. Perhaps a little unfortunately, and not unknown to members in this House, there was something of a dispute going on at the time about the issue of our relationship with the European Community.
John Cryer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think probably unlike every previous speaker, I only met the Queen once, and that was when she visited, appropriately enough, the Queen's Theatre in Hornchurch, which was then my constituency. And when she left, she went on, as she always did, to go from strength to strength, I left to be ejected from Parliament by the voters at the following election. So we had slightly different experiences after her visit. As the leader of the Liberal Democrats has said, it's difficult to imagine the world without her, and that's absolutely true. But it's worth remembering something that is very rarely remembered, and that is that in 1936, after the abdication crisis, the monarchy teetered on the brink. And according to most polls at that time, most British voters thought the monarchy might not survive for very long. Now, since 1945, the monarchy has been the most popular institution in Britain and has polled something like 80%. There's no institution that's polled anything like that level of popularity over such a sustained period of time. Now, that's not an accident. It happened for two reasons, both because the Queen and her father, George VI, had that iron dedication to public service, which possibly started in the most spectacular way when George VI decided to remain in London during the war, instead of following the advice to leave London and go elsewhere, perhaps even to Canada, as one advisor told him. That started then, but the second reason is that both George VI and Elizabeth II had an absolutely clear understanding of the constitutional parameters of the role of the monarchy, and neither of them ever strayed outside that role. And in the case of the Queen, despite repeated attempts to pull her into political controversies, including the first one I can remember was in 1974, we had a hung parliament. And there was article after article in the press in those days saying that the Queen should intervene, should pull the parties together, the two big parties, perhaps the three big parties, to form some sort of coalition government, and she refused to do it. And she was absolutely right to refuse to do it. And she was persistent in that all the way through. And that's her great legacy, that the monarchy has survived as that popular institution because she observed those absolutely correct constitutional parameters. And I think we can all hope that if the new king, as I'm sure he will, observes those parameters and has that dedication to public service which he's already demonstrated, he can reunite and draw together a nation which is as bitterly divided as I can remember.
Dame Andrea Leadsom.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today was strange to wake up to the first day without our much-loved and hugely respected Queen Elizabeth II. There is a sense of personal loss as well as shock. Somehow her long years of service, commitment and duty felt as if they would never come to an end. As one of the older members of my family told me just this morning, things changed so much in her and our lifetime, and sometimes we feel hopelessly out of date and rather uncomfortable. She was our figurehead, and for that we are truly grateful. The Queen's reign was somehow timeless. Listening back this morning to her first televised Christmas broadcast in 1957, and then to her broadcast to the nation during COVID, Queen Elizabeth II proved continuity right from the post-war years through 15 different prime ministers, from Sir Winston Churchill to my right honourable friend, the member for South West Norfolk, and to the extraordinary, heartwarming royal digital performances with James Bond and with Paddington Bear. For me, her handbag will now always contain a marmalade sandwich. I always remember being sworn in as a Privy Councillor. It was the same day as my right honourable friend, the member for Uxbridge, and we were given the usual briefing on how you kneel on a footstool with your right hand by your side, your left hand holding a Bible, and my right honourable friend and I looked at each other and were like, what if you fall off your footstool? And we were told very straight-faced, don't worry, the Queen will find it very amusing, which we didn't find reassuring, but luckily it didn't happen. As Lord President of the Council during the hung Parliament of 2017 to 2019, I had the honour of regular audiences with the Queen ahead of Privy Council meetings. On those occasions, I was always struck by the warmth of the welcome and the frankness of the conversation. The Queen was always interested to hear updates on the progress of legislation and the mood of the House. She was very well informed and also quite challenging at a time of extraordinary events, from Brexit to Donald Trump's visit to behaviour scandals here in Westminster. Once a year, the leaders of the Commons and Lords would be invited to Windsor Castle for lunch with the Queen and Prince Philip. These occasions felt quite overwhelming, but at the same time, after a pre-lunch drink in the sitting room and getting into a conversation about how well the restoration of Windsor Castle was presided over by Prince Philip compared to our own efforts to restore the Palace of Westminster, Baroness Evans of Bowes Park and I were very soon distracted as we sought to defend the indefensible. A happy memory for me is going to Sandringham for Privy Council one January, with log fires burning and the Queen's corgis pottering around. I recall the Queen saying what a very busy Christmas she'd had, and I suggested, well, at least her family don't need to pause Christmas lunch for the Queen's speech, at which she told me they most certainly did. As for all of us, her family would pause lunch and watch the Queen's speech, and Princess Charlotte had run over to the TV screen and said, "Look, there's Gangan." Very heartwarming. At each of the audiences, it would strike me anew that Privy Council meetings were just one of the many daily duties of the Queen, and that her cheerfulness and her twinkling eyes were always a constant. Truly, she was a monarch who put the comfort of others above herself, and she never faltered in her promise to spend her life devoted to service. And as we've prayed every day sitting in this place that Queen Elizabeth I may always incline to thy will and walk in thy way, so I believe we can now pray with confidence that after this life she may attain everlasting joy and felicity through Jesus Christ our Lord. Queen Elizabeth II spent her life building relationships in our nation, our Commonwealth and across the world. In her achievements we can all take comfort and know that as the crown passes to our new king, we will have the example of her legacy to unite us in loyal allegiance to her.
Well, of course, from the pictures we're seeing, we can see that King Charles III and Queen Consort Camilla, they have arrived in London, where he's expected to address the nation later today at 6 p.m. They stayed overnight in Balmoral Castle, where the Queen passed away on Thursday. We understand that King Charles will be meeting with the Prime Minister, Liz Truss, ahead of his first address to the nation at 6 p.m. today.
Someone who lived through an era of profound upheaval and change, but who represented continuity and certainty amidst the tumult. When she was born, it's hard to remember that in 1926 only 10 women had ever been elected into this place, into this House of Commons. And at that time, women did not exercise the vote on the same terms as men. Thankfully, that has now changed, though I always say that work to achieve equality is never done. But she, as the mother of the house said earlier, led just by example. She led by being. She demonstrated as our head of state, who was clearly, obviously, a woman and a wife and a mother, how possible it was, even if that had been granted to her by fate, by destiny, to combine the roles of the pressure that she had on her with a family life. Her coronation was the first to be televised. Now the monarchy has a presence on social media platforms seen by billions. Her reign has seen the transition from empire to Commonwealth, from conflict to peace in Northern Ireland, but also from complacency to climate emergency, which demonstrates to all of us that we have much to do and many problems to confront us. The values she personified are clear and have been clear from the comments in this House: utter commitment to public service and duty. A woman who dedicated her life to the service of our nation. And when she said at 21 in a broadcast, "I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service," that is a vow that she delivered, as we now know, faithfully right up until the very end. She personified wisdom and experience, but she did, as the Honourable Lady who's just spoken has just said, have that twinkle in her eye. Whenever you were waiting in line to meet Her Majesty, you could see the twinkle and it put you at ease. She first visited Wirral in 1957, but during my time in this house, she first came to Birkenhead when she opened the Europa Pool in 1996, and finally came to Wallasey for the second time in 2011 to open the newly rebuilt floral pavilion in New Brighton. Thousands upon thousands of official duties, many thousands of my constituents looked forward to her visits and have fond memories of them. She was always interested, always engaging, and always smiling and reassuring when she interacted with people who lined the routes to see her on these fantastic occasions. So her loss will be mourned. It's a terrible but inevitable loss. She left us in a place where we know we can survive the transition because of the strength she gave to the institution. So may she rest in peace, Madam Deputy Speaker. And we all wish the greatest condolences to the royal family who are going through such terrible loss now. And we look forward to supporting the new king as much as we've supported our now sadly lost Queen Elizabeth II.
It's a pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Lady. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm filled with great sadness as I rise to pay tribute to the life and the memory of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Our thoughts are with the royal family and who have lost a mother, a grandmother and of course a great-grandmother. Her Majesty lived an extraordinary life of service, and the touching tributes that we have already heard from Right Honourable and Honourable members so far, along with the outpouring of emotion from across the world, including from my own constituents in Bromsgrove District, reflect the deep affection and love in which she was held. For over 7 decades, she was a source of our strength and comfort, a representative of our closest held values and beliefs, a defender of faith, and an embodiment of the very best of public service and duty. She was our North Star, a symbol of strength in difficult times. To put it simply, she was our Queen. Right Honourable and Honourable members, many have shared their times of when they were privileged to meet Her late Majesty. And I was able to do so on many occasions, and I always welcomed the huge wisdom she would share, the advice, and of course the good humour. I will never forget during the occasion of the final Privy Council meeting of 2017, as the formalities ended, Her Majesty suddenly said, "Gin and tonic, anybody?" and proceeded to press a buzzer. And with that, her staff promptly burst through the doors of the 1844 room in Buckingham Palace, armed with trays of G&T and nibbles. Now, I'm not much of a G&T drinker myself, but I certainly was not going to turn down the opportunity of enjoying one with Her late Majesty. I later learned that she'd like to make the last Privy Council meeting of the year extra special, so that she could wish everyone a Merry Christmas. Madam Deputy Speaker, our country faces immense challenges at home and abroad, and the person that has always been there is there no longer. However, in the wake of this terrible loss, it is an opportunity for parliamentarians from across this House to renew their commitment to the values that were embodied by Her late Majesty: public service, duty, the national interest. If we can leave this place having achieved but the smallest fraction of what Her late Majesty achieved, our country would be the better for it. Yeah. After a lifetime of service, Her late Majesty is now at rest. May she rest in peace, and God save the King.
Lystafel Roberts.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Dr Prif-Lefarydd. And on behalf of Plaid Cymru, I would like to offer my sincerest sympathies and condolences to Her Majesty the Queen's children and her extended family as they come to terms with their grief. Queen Elizabeth II has been a constant presence throughout all our lives. She stood as a figure of stability in a world that is changing at a rapid and sometimes frightening pace. The loss of the continuity that Her Majesty embodied is a source of sorrow and anxiety for people across the world. Up to her final days, she conducted her duties with an extraordinary dedication that has been an inspiration for so many of us. Her values of duty, service, reconciliation and forgiveness are values that the people of Wales hold very dear. In Wales, we respect people who embody that sense of dedication to society and to public service, who put their public duty first. Her Majesty the Queen personified that duty for so many people for so many years. And Her Majesty had a canny ability to put people at ease in the midst of palace formality. When I was fortunate to be appointed to the Privy Council 3 years ago, I remember being nervous, being intimidated by the protocols and the rules that govern interactions with the royal family. Your mind, as it would do, tots up an infinite checklist of everything that could possibly go wrong. And what struck me was something she said. She said, "You may well be worrying that you'll do something wrong or in the wrong order. Don't worry. Whatever could possibly go wrong, I've seen it all before. There's nothing that you could do that would shock me now." Even among all the pomp and ceremony, there was that characteristic warmth and courtesy to the Queen. And Her Majesty was a magnificent role model for older women across the world. Historically, of course, older women have disappeared from public life. The Queen was a constant, visible figure throughout the 70 years of her reign. From historic buildings and charities to football, she always showed an interest in Wales. People of all walks of Welsh life have been touched by the Queen's keen interest and constant support of Welsh organisations.
Well, you're watching live pictures of King Charles III and Queen Consort Camilla, who just arrived in London. They had stayed overnight in Balmoral Castle, where the Queen passed away. That's Queen Elizabeth II, where she passed away on Thursday. 73-year-old King Charles III is expected to meet with the Prime Minister Liz Truss ahead of his first address to the nation at 6 p.m. today. And while that is happening, we are also having a special session of the UK Parliament to pay tribute to the late Queen Elizabeth II, who has been described as one of the greatest leaders who ever lived on this earth and the rock on which modern Britain was built.